He trusted the dead more than the living. In the torch-lit chamber beneath his palace, the emperor lay upon a bed of polished bones, each aligned like the ribs of a slumbering giant. His crown, fused from the skulls of fallen kings, glimmered with a pale, breathless light. Courtiers called it invincible terror, a throne forged from mortality itself. Yet they never saw the stillness in his eyes when the torches flickered low. To them, he was a myth. To himself, he was a man hiding inside armor, carved from death. The bones did not betray, did not whisper schemes, did not hunger for favor. They offered silence, and he mistook silence for safety. He built a kingdom on quiet. What few knew was that this ritual began long before he commanded legions, long before fear became empire. As a child locked in darkness, he learned to listen to stillness and call it protection. Now that memory ruled him more completely than any crown. Only the bones remembered what he tried to forget. To understand the emperor, you must first meet the child in the crypt.
Your attention keeps these echoes alive. For a moment, let the torches fade and return to your own quiet room. The soft hum around your headphones, the steady rhythm of your breath. Here, these dark histories can unfold safely, slowly, without haste. If you're listening from far away, share where you are. It helps this strange little archive feel human.
Before he ruled over skulls, he spent a night begging them to wake. He was only 7, a prince small enough that even his shadow seemed afraid to follow him. For disobedience, the tutors dragged him beneath the palace and locked him inside the royal crypt as punishment. The door slammed like a verdict. His torch was tiny, its flame trembling as if terrified of where it burned. Cold stone pressed against his palms, each breath rising white against the air. At first he cried for guards, for his mother, for anyone who breathed. But the crypt held only silence, a silence deep enough to bruise the heart.
Reset line, fear needs an audience. When the torch guttered, he stumbled backward, colliding with a row of ancient skulls. Their hollow eyes stared into him, unblinking, unchanging, untouched by fear. He froze, waiting for them to move, accuse, or laugh as the living always did.
Instead, they remained exactly as they were, still, patient, impossibly honest. He crept closer, lifting one skull with hands that shook like candle flame in wind. It did not flinch when he whispered apologies. It did not judge when he confessed his fear. For the first time, he felt seen without risk.
So he talked to them, softly at first, then in trembling bursts, about lessons, punishments, and the loneliness no one believed he carried. The skulls answered only with silence, and in that silence, he found something that felt like shelter.
He curled beside them, letting the cold seep into his bones, until fear hardened into clarity. The living changed. The dead stayed loyal. By dawn, he no longer trembled. He rose from the crypt with the torch burned low and a new certainty carved into him like scripture. Fear was not darkness. Fear was people. Years later, When he claimed his first victory, he knew exactly what to do with the skull of his enemy. He carried it not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the night he learned where truth lived and where betrayal slept. In the echo of that childhood crypt, he forged the belief that bones alone could hold a promise without breaking it. Every ruler seeks counsel, but his counselors would forever be the unmoving faces he first touched in terror, the only companions who had never turned away. From that night onward, his heart learned to trust stillness more than speech, shadows more than servants, and the quiet certainty of bone over the uncertain mercy of breath.
And so the child who once trembled in darkness became the emperor who slept inside it. He never forgot that night's cold truth.
He wanted every bow to begin with a flinch. The battle had ended at dusk, the field still steaming with the heat of dying men. He walked among the bodies not as conqueror, but as collector, searching for the one skull that mattered. When he found the rival king slumped against a shattered banner, he knelt, studying the face that had terrified nations. Blood still glistened in the man's beard, but his eyes were already hollow, already honest. "Take the head," he said. His generals hesitated. He did not repeat himself. By dawn, the skull lay on a marble slab deep inside the palace workshop. The artisans gathered around it, hands trembling, chisels shaking like winter branches. They exchanged glances, hoping one of them would refuse, so the others could follow. None dared. Fear thins the air. His footsteps echoed through the chamber, slow, deliberate. "Clean it," he ordered. "Carve it. Honor it." Honor. The word tasted wrong in their mouths, yet they obeyed. For hours they scraped away flesh, boiled bone, polished the surface until it shone like pale marble. The scent of hot iron and old blood clung to their robes. When at last the skull was bare, he approached, touching its crown with reverence. Its stillness steadied him more than any victory. He handed them gold wire, black iron, fragments of obsidian. "Bind them to it," he said. "Let fear have a shape." Hammer met bone. Chisel kissed history. The artisans worked in silence, each strike a prayer they did not understand. When the final piece was fitted, the crown gleamed like a relic unearthed from some forbidden tomb. The first time he placed it upon his head, the workshop fell utterly still. Even the torches seemed to lower their flames in deference. He entered the throne room at dusk, the skull crown lit from behind like a halo forged from death. Advisors who once met his gaze without hesitation now flinched. Their recoil washed over him like a blessing. It was the same feeling he remembered from the crypt, that shiver of awe the living give the dead. He stood taller, the skull's hollow eyes aligned with his own. The chamber felt smaller around him, tighter, more obedient. Fear had always been currency. Now it was architecture. The general beside him whispered, "Majesty, this is not a crown." "No," he replied, lifting his chin. "It is truth." If his head needed the dead, his body soon would too. He thought if the dead held him, nothing living could take him. Sleep had become a battlefield long after his enemies were gone. Each night he lay upon silk and softness, yet felt hunted by memory, by breath, by the unpredictable pulse of the living.
The shadows in his chamber shifted too easily. Curtains whispered like conspirators. Even the wind felt alive enough to betray him. So he returned to the lesson of the crypt. Only the dead stay faithful. Only bone keeps its promises. Fear prefers something that cannot move.
He summoned craftsmen at midnight, their eyes burning with questions they dared not voice. "Strip the bed," he said, "all of it." They removed velvet, stuffing, cedar wood, until only a cold skeletal frame remained. He stepped forward, touched it, and felt nothing. No warmth, no heartbeat. Safety. "Bring bones," he whispered. They retrieved them from forgotten tombs and battlefields, bleaching them, polishing them until each piece gleamed like moonlit marble. Ribs aligned into an arch beneath his spine, femurs forming the supports, vertebrae interlocking like a shield of prayer. The artisans worked in terrified silence, while the emperor watched with breath held, as if witnessing memory take shape. When it was finished, he dismissed everyone and stood alone before the ossuary he had turned into sanctuary. The chamber smelled of dust and old winter. Torches sputtered softly, their flames bending toward the white structure as though drawn by reverence. He lay down slowly, expecting pain. Instead, the bones welcomed him. Their rigidity steadied him. Their chill numbed the restless pulse that never left his throat. His breathing slowed, falling into rhythm with a quiet deeper than rest, closer to surrender. Here he could not be surprised. Nothing stirred beneath him. Nothing conspired. Nothing reached back.
He closed his eyes and almost imagined the bones tightening around him like an embrace, not crushing, but holding. Firm, absolute, eternal. A cradle carved from death, but comfort came with cost. He could no longer recall the sensation of softness.
Feathers, wool, warmth, these became myth. The memory of stone replaced them all. In seeking peace, he abandoned every comfort that made peace worth seeking. Each night he sank deeper into the architecture of bone, and each morning he woke further from the world of breath and heartbeat.
Soon, his private rituals would become the blueprint of an entire palace.
He wanted the empire to walk through death before it ever saw his face. The decree fell across the council table like a shadow no torch could soften. Engineers, artisans, master builders, all summoned at dawn, scrolls trembling in hand as the emperor revealed his vision. A court carved not from marble or cedar, but from bone. Not symbolic bone, actual bone. At first, they thought he meant memorial sculptures, funerary ornaments. But when he unrolled the plans, silence thickened. Pillars ribbed like the chests of giants, doorways framed with fused jawbones, thrones anchored upon vertebrae, polished until they gleamed like frozen waves. torchlight would strike every surface, turning visitors into shifting ghosts. "Begin with the enemies," he said. "Their bones have already betrayed their masters. No one dared breathe too loudly."
Soon the work began, grim, methodical, unstoppable. Carts arrived at all hours, first with the remains of fallen rivals, then criminals condemned for treason, then political prisoners whose names were erased before their bodies cooled. Bone by bone, the architects built a cathedral of fear.
Chisels rang like distant bells, each strike releasing a puff of white dust that settled on hair, skin, silence. Workers whispered prayers, not for themselves, but for what the empire was becoming. Weeks bled into months. The halls rose tall and pale, echoing with both grandeur and grief. Torchlight rippled across the shaped pillars, illuminating hollow sockets of skulls embedded high above the floor. Officials learned to avert their eyes, pretending not to see the faint remnants of jaw lines that once spoke oath and plea alike. Yet the emperor walked through the unfinished corridors with a serenity he never found among the living. Each arch, each lattice of bone steadied something in him. Betrayal could not hide in stillness. Treason could not spark where the breath had long since fled. With every completed chamber, he felt a thicker barrier rising between himself and the unpredictable pulse of humanity. He stood in the center of the nearly finished court, eyes closed, breathing in the cold, dry air. "Here," he murmured, "truth will have no breath to lie."
But terror alone cannot hold an empire. It must be performed.
Their laughter never quite covered the sound of loose teeth shifting underfoot. The first banquet in the ossuary hall was meant to dazzle the empire. Torchlight rippled across polished bone, reflecting inside goblets like captured moons. The skeletal columns rose in pale spirals, carved from the remains of enemies and offenders whose names no longer belonged to history. The guests arrived draped in silk and jewels, but the moment they crossed the threshold, their finery felt thin, almost temporary, beside the permanence of death sculpted into architecture. Dancers swept between ribbed pillars, their shadows gliding over skulls set into the walls. Anklets chimed delicately, competing with the faint clatter beneath the floor, bones settling under weight. A reminder that the palace breathed only because the dead were willing to hold it upright. Servants poured wine into crystal goblets, careful not to spill a drop. Every surface reflected them back, distorted in white curves of femurs and the glint of fused jawlines. A noblewoman forced a smile as she lifted her drink, but when her gaze met the hollow sockets above her, her face blanched. She excused herself with perfect etiquette, only to vomit quietly behind a pillar carved from the spine of a traitor. A foreign ambassador nearly fainted, gripping the table until color returned to his cheeks. He toasted the emperor with trembling admiration, praising the bold majesty of a ruler unafraid of mortality. His voice cracked on the last word. No one commented. Fear makes the best host. The emperor presided over it all with calm satisfaction. He watched his guests shift in their seats, their glances skittering from skull to shadow. Reassurance bloomed in their discomfort. Fear was the one language that needed no translation. His closest advisor sipped his wine mechanically, staring too long at the columns. Those cheekbones looked familiar. So did the slope of that jaw. Quietly, almost unconsciously, he began counting.
1, 2, 3. How many old rivals had vanished only to reappear holding up the roof? How many former allies had been repurposed into art? And still, when the emperor raised his goblet, the hall erupted in applause.
Too loud, too quick, too eager to drown out its own dread. The dancers spun faster, the musicians played harder, the torches flared as if feeding on fear itself. One man at these feasts understood the palace better than anyone, the servant who knew each skull by number. He could no longer sleep without seeing the faces he dusted each morning. His job was simple, or so the emperor had decreed. Maintain the bonework, polish the arches, repair any fractures the palace revealed. But simplicity dies quickly in a place built from the dead. Each dawn he entered the ossuary halls with a thin brush, a cloth, and a ledger he was never meant to keep. Dust rose in pale breaths as he swept it from empty sockets, from the delicate ridges of jawbones, from the fused crowns of vertebrae that held the ceilings aloft. He worked quietly, whispering numbers under his breath. 37, 38, 39. Counting soothed him at first. Order imposed upon horror. But then the numbers began to shift. Not because he miscounted, but because new faces appeared. Faces he recognized. Faces that had argued in council meetings. Faces that bowed too slowly or asked too many questions. He never wrote names, only notched the ledger. A stroke for every skull that once held a memory.
Dissenters came first, then rivals, then a man whose only crime had been knowing the emperor as a child. The servant dusted his skull for 3 mornings before he allowed himself to cry. Horror grows quietly when no one speaks.
What frightened him most was the silence. Bone never complained. Bone never bled. Bone never announced its arrival. One day a man walked the halls with pride. The next, his face appeared above the doorframe, polished and empty.
He began noticing patterns others refused to see. How the emperor wandered the throne room long after the court slept. How advisors vanished after offering caution instead of praise. How architects whispered among themselves, afraid to touch new shipments of material. And always he was there, dusting, counting, remembering. The palace's unwilling conscience, breathing life into the dead, simply by acknowledging what they once were.
Torchlight flickered across the skulls as he moved, shadows swaying like ghosts trying to speak. He paused often, pressing his forehead to cool stone, whispering apologies none could hear. Rumors seeped into the city. People whispered the palace was haunted, not by spirits, but by knowledge. Mothers pulled children close near the gates. Merchants walked faster, avoiding the echo spilling from the halls like distant weeping. And slowly, the living began to wonder how long they would agree to walk through the dead.
In his empire, the worst sentence was to become part of the view. The decree arrived at sunrise, unfurled by trembling scribes whose ink-stained fingers shook around bone-carved quills. They knew what they wrote today would turn justice into masonry.
The emperor's new law declared that certain crimes, treason, dissent, disobedience spoken too loudly, were no longer punishable by exile or death. They were punishable by incorporation. The word sounded clean, almost ceremonial, but everyone knew what it meant. By midday, the first trial began. The accused was a merchant whose only mistake was refusing to overpay a noble. His family cried innocence. Evidence was thin, motives unclear. None of that mattered. A structural crack had appeared in the eastern hall, and a new column was required.
"Guilty," the judge said, voice trembling. "By decree, you will serve the empire in permanence." The phrase had become shorthand for erasure.
The servant who counted skulls watched from the back of the hall, ledger clutched tight. He saw the moment the merchant understood, not when the sentence was read, but when he looked at the walls and recognized a jawline he once bargained with. Someone he knew, someone he laughed with, now part of the architecture.
The man collapsed. His family's screams filled the chamber, stretching against stone. Guards dragged him away, armor clattering like loose bones. The servant closed his eyes. He knew where they would take him. He knew which arch still had space. And he knew that tomorrow morning he would dust a new skull, whisper a new number, add a shaking mark to his ledger.
Reset line becomes cruelty the moment truth stops mattering. More scrolls followed. Laws declaring dissent a structural flaw. Laws redefining political rivals as material assets. Each decree strengthened the palace while hollowing the empire.
People walked faster past the ossuary gates, clutching their children tighter. Some covered their mouths with scarves, as if fabric could shield them from attention. And for a time, the streets stayed quiet. Fear can smother outrage. Fear can silence the living as effectively as it elevates the dead.
But terror can quiet a crowd only for a time.
The living rose once and were taught how easily they could be turned into stone. It began not with banners or speeches, but with whispers. Soft, furtive sounds drifting through alleyways at dusk. Plans traded beneath cloaks. Names spoken only once. Promises sealed by trembling hands.
Covered faces gathered in abandoned warehouses. Lanterns hooded so tightly the flames could barely breathe. They spoke of justice, of memory, of taking back a city being carved into a mausoleum. No one used the word rebellion. It felt too loud, for lungs already filled with fear.
Small defiance appeared first. Bone columns smeared with ash, torches snuffed out in deliberate silence. A sigil chalked on doorsteps, 3 lines, 1 broken. The mark of the living, refusing erasure. Then one night, they rose. Hundreds gathered at the palace gate, faces wrapped in cloth, chains stolen from the armory wound around their wrists. They moved like a single breath, determined, desperate. For a heartbeat, it seemed possible. The guards faltered. The servant who counted skulls felt something flicker in his chest. Hope.
But the emperor was ready. His soldiers descended like iron rain, armored shadows crushing momentum with ruthless precision. The rebels fought savagely, but bone walls do not tremble, and fear cannot hold a line. Screams ricocheted through the corridors. By dawn, the uprising lay shattered. The captured leaders were dragged to the ossuary court, bruised, breathless, but burning with hatred the emperor had never seen. He watched with a calm that chilled even his generals. "Add them," he said, and so they were added, cleaned, carved, incorporated. New arches rose within days, built from those who dared resist. Officials admired the speed of construction. Citizens lowered their heads, pretending not to recognize familiar cheekbones now fused into architecture. The emperor walked the halls afterward, reassured by the new bones surrounding him. Yet that night, sleep refused him. His breath stuttered, his pulse raced, and for the first time in years, he felt watched. Not by living, but by the dead he trusted most. "Down here," he said, "even history kneels." The torches hissed as they descended, each step sinking deeper into the belly of the palace. Stone gave way to bone, and bone to something older than fear. Dripping water tapped from the ceiling, each drop striking the floor like a slow heartbeat. Smoke curled through the passage, thick with damp earth and extinguished hope. The emperor led the procession, torch held high, its flame clawing shadows across endless rows of skulls. Their sockets watched with hollow patience. Every few steps he paused, leaning closer, whispering names no one had spoken in decades. The guests exchanged uneasy glances. The servant who counted skulls listened, unsure if the emperor spoke to the dead or for them. The corridors narrowed. Bones lined the walls, floor to ceiling, ribs nested like shattered wings, femurs fused into pillars, entire spines bending into archways above their heads. Water dripped from skulls overhead, trailing down calcified jaws like tears.
Some guests broke early. A merchant whispered that the temperature had dropped, his breath fogged in the air. When he brushed a wall, a skull tilted, its teeth clicking faintly. He collapsed, screaming into the labyrinth.
Others grew enthralled. A noblewoman pressed her palm to a ribbed column, whispering prayers to the remains. Another guest asked whether the emperor selected who ascended into the architecture. Admiration, not fear, shaped his voice. The emperor's voice rose through the catacombs. "These were kings," he said softly. "Warriors, betrayers, devotees, all serve still." Torchlight bent around him like something obedient. The guests bowed their heads, unsure whether they were witnessing a ritual or being pulled into one. At the deepest vault, the bones grew darker, older, almost fossilized. Here, silence didn't feel empty. It felt aware. The emperor closed his eyes, breathing deeply. The servant, standing just behind him, heard it too. A whisper. Not breathing, not echo. Something answering. That night, on his bed of bones, the emperor hears something he has never heard before. The dead answering back. The bed that once guarded his sleep now refused to let him rest. He lay inside the ossuary chamber, torches burning low, their flames quivering like frightened eyes. For years the bone bed had been sanctuary, cold, still, predictable. But tonight, something breathed beneath him.
A faint tremor, a shift, a breath not his own. He froze, silence tightening around him like a closing fist. Then came the sound, soft as a fingernail dragging across stone, grinding bone, weight shifting where no living hand could move. He jerked upright, heart battering against his ribs. The skulls on the walls stared back, unchanged, yet he heard them murmuring, tiny threads of sound weaving like broken lullabies. Names. Names he had carved into architecture. Names he had tried to forget. Sleep became fragments, brittle breaths of unconsciousness, invaded by visions too sharp to be dreams. Accusing faces leaned over him, hollow sockets filling with breath. A jawbone cracked open, speaking his childhood name. He woke screaming.
Servants rushed in, torches flaring. They found him curled against the vertebrae headboard, claw marks streaking his arms, nails torn, blood fresh beneath them. The bone bed bore scratches, new ones, deep ones. "It moved," he whispered. I felt it move." Servants rushed in, torches flaring. They found him curled against the vertebrae headboard, claw marks streaking his arms, nails torn, blood fresh beneath them. The bone bed bore scratches, new ones, deep ones. "It moved," he whispered. I felt it move." His breath shook. His eyes glistened with the terror of a man who could no longer tell where the dead ended and where his mind began. That night he barred the ossuary doors, refused attendance, refused food. The torches sank into ember glow as he whispered into the dark, pleading for silence. But the more he begged, the more he felt watched. Not by enemies, by the dead he trusted. His fear shifted shape. He no longer feared the living. Now he feared the dead.
It was not the dead who judged him. It was their stories. He led the servant downward, deeper than ceremony, deeper than rebellion, deeper even than fear. Here the torches did not burn. They hovered, flames bending into halos, wary of touching the walls. Names hung in the air before they were spoken, waiting like trapped breath. He stopped in the vault's center, surrounded by skulls older than the palace itself. "Tell me," he whispered, "why do they speak to me?" His voice fractured on the question. The servant held his ledger tight. "They aren't speaking," he said softly. "You are finally hearing." The emperor trembled. "Say their names." The servant hesitated, then opened the ledger. Dust rose like old confessions. He spoke the first name. A faint echo brushed the skulls like a sigh. Then another name, and another, and another. Each name unfurled with the weight of a life once lived. A father who refused surrender. A soldier who hesitated once. A scholar whose questions cut too sharply. A friend who trusted him. The torch halos trembled,
His breath grew thin. As the servant read, the emperor began to hear not names, but verdicts. He begged for mercy, the servant murmured. She asked for her children. He died calling your name. The emperor staggered into a pillar of vertebrae. Enough, he rasped. But the servant continued. He had become the oracle the palace needed, the witness who could turn silence into truth. Then the last page. And this, the servant whispered, voice breaking, is the man whose skull you sleep upon. The emperor looked up. Countless hollow eyes stared back. For the first time, he did not feel protected. He felt outnumbered, surrounded not by loyalty, but by memory. He sank to his knees as the torch halos recoiled from him. The servant closed the ledger. Silence pressed inward like a final sentence. When the emperor rose, his hands were empty. He left the chamber without the crown. And by nightfall, the palace whispered that they had seen him bareheaded. For the first time, he saw they were not looking at him. They were looking at what he had made of them. He moved through the palace bareheaded, and the absence of the skull crown hit harder than any decree. Courtiers froze mid-step. Servants bowed too quickly, as if bowing might erase their fear. Even the torchlight dimmed, robbed of the bone gleam it once adored. His exposed skin felt vulnerable, as though the air itself had teeth. He walked slowly, breath forced into discipline. For years he mistook stillness for safety. Now, without death resting on his brow, the silence felt different, less obedient, more honest. Advisors who once begged for his gaze kept their eyes down, afraid he might see guilt or something worse, sorrow. He reached the ossuary hall and stopped. The bone pillars rose like monuments to choices he could no longer defend.
He placed his hand on one rib, polished smooth by time. A sensation stabbed through him, not calm, pain, as if the bone remembered, as if it recoiled. He whispered an apology. The echo returned, stripped of authority. Just a tired man with too many ghosts.
From the shadows stood the servant who counted skulls. For the first time, he did not kneel. He simply watched the emperor the way one watches a wounded animal, deciding whether to fight or surrender. Their eyes met. Something fragile flickered. Regret, recognition, the faint outline of a different ending. But the empire shifted beneath them like unstable earth. Rumors climbed the walls faster than vines. Some whispered the crown had rejected him. Others swore he had gone mad. A few, trembling, wondered if he might change. He stepped back from the bone pillar, dust clinging to his fingertips like ash. "It is too late," he murmured, not to the servant, but to the palace itself. That night, he chooses to sleep one last time on the bed of bones, and to go where even his guards will not follow. Take a breath. Let the torchlight dim. Let the echoes settle. For the first time, he went below not as a king, but as a man seeking judgment. The palace slept above him, dim, hollow, unaware, its ruler slipping from his chambers, without guards, without armor, without the crown that once spoke for him. He carried it now in both hands, held low, its fused skulls staring upward like witnesses waiting for confession. His bare footsteps echoed down the stairwell, each step slower than the last, as though the air grew thicker with every descent. Torches burned as thin, trembling flames, flickering like dying breaths. Shadows swayed around him, not in fear, but in recognition. This was where his reign had been born. It was where it would end. He paused at the first landing, lifting the crown. "I should have listened," he whispered, as if the skulls were mentors he had disappointed. His breath fogged in the cold. His fingers tightened on bone polished by years of dread. "I should have remembered. Your silence meant warning, not worship." He descended again. Bones lined the walls, ribs stacked like cathedral vaults, skulls watching from alcoves carved into stone. He touched one, tracing the cheek of a scholar whose questions once threatened his certainty. "Your name," he murmured. "Tell me again." He had never asked before. Tonight he asked them all. Whispered apologies scattered behind him, like brittle leaves in a dying season. He begged forgiveness from the wronged, from the feared, from those he turned into architecture so he would never again feel small. His voice cracked on every third breath, as though his lungs were learning a language softer than command.
Unseen, the servant followed a silhouette trembling against torchlight, heart pounding with the knowledge that this was the emperor's last walk. He watched the crown sway in the emperor's grip and understood. The man who ruled through death sought something quieter now. Absolution, surrender, or perhaps simply rest.
At the threshold of the deepest chamber, the emperor stopped. The darkness ahead felt alive, waiting with ancient patience. He exhaled slowly, as if emptying his life into the dust-filled air. "In the morning," he whispered, "only dust will greet the living." And then he stepped inside. When the guards came at sunrise, the only thing seated on the throne was dust. Light crept through high windows in thin, reverent beams, illuminating the hall like a tomb exposed to mourning for the first time in centuries. The crown rested on the stone seat, untouched, its skulls staring outward with quiet resignation. No footprints marked the floor. No breath stirred the banners. Silence hung like a decision. One guard stepped forward, trembling. His fingers brushed the throne's armrest. Dust rose gently, drifting through sunbeams like pale ash. Then the servant appeared. He walked slowly, as though 10 years had passed overnight. He did not look at the throne. His eyes moved directly to the stairway leading below. "He isn't here," he murmured. "Come." Torches flared, voices softened. Together they descended. The air cooled. Bones shimmered faintly from the walls, their whiteness catching the torchlight like distant stars.
The servant led them to the deepest chamber, the place where names had been spoken, where truth had cracked his crown. And there they found him. No guard surrounding him, no crown adorning him, no struggle carved into his features. He lay on the bone bed as if it were made for rest, not fear, hands folded gently over his chest.
The skulls around him seemed to watch with something resembling sympathy, their hollow eyes softened by shadow and dust. The torch flames bowed inward, dimming, as if acknowledging the passing of a man who had lived too long in their unblinking company. The guards stepped forward slowly, unsure whether they witnessed tragedy or release. The servant knelt beside him, resting one hand on the cold ribs beneath him. "He came home," he whispered, "at last." No wounds marked the emperor's body. No violence disturbed the chamber. His end was simply stillness, the same stillness he had worshipped, feared, and built into an empire. A man undone not by enemies, but by memory. They carried him up the stairwell in silence. Dust rose around their feet like faint prayers. In the throne room, the crown still waited, glinting softly in the rising sun. Empires fear a power vacuum, but sometimes what follows is not chaos, but memory. They could not undo what he had built, but they could decide what it meant. The new rulers entered the ossuary court with slow, deliberate steps, as if afraid the bones might still remember the weight of his commands. Dust drifted through morning light, settling over skulls that had witnessed tyranny rise and fall. A single question hung in the air. What does a nation do with the remains of its own fear? They chose not destruction, but transformation. The throne room changed first. Skeletal pillars were taken down piece by piece, bones brushed clean and carried into the gardens.
There, beneath soft soil and quiet stone markers, the dead were given rest. Simple names etched into slate, human once more.
But not all the bonework vanished. Some halls remained, pale and silent, standing as reminders of the years when silence ruled louder than truth, tracing the carved names the servant once whispered into his ledger. He continued his work, but with different tools. No longer dusting skulls, but clearing soil from memorial stones. No longer counting the dead to measure fear, but reciting their stories to preserve memory. Children gathered beside him. He told them of the emperor, not as a monster, but as a boy who never left the crypt where fear first found him. "Power," he said softly, "is only dangerous when it is afraid." And the children listened, and the adults bowed their heads. Slowly, the palace softened. Roses bloomed in courtyards once thick with bone dust. Birds nested in arches that remained. The air grew lighter, as if the kingdom exhaled for the first time in a generation. The past was not hidden. The bone halls opened to the public, held plaques etched with one line: "Let this stand, not as threat, but as a memory." People traveled from distant cities to walk the corridors, to confront what fear had built and what compassion chose to change. And so, in time, the roar of bones faded into a single, enduring silence. In the end, his true prison was never made of bones. The palace still stands, though the bones are fewer now. Sunlight falls where once only torchlight burned, and halls that echoed with skulls now hold gentler sounds: footsteps, whispers, the turning of pages. The air carries no threat, only memory. They say the emperor vanished into the catacombs he built. Lying down at last among the dead, He trusted more than the living.
But his story didn't end there. It lingers in every ruler who confuses control with safety, in every heart that stacks its fears into invisible walls.
He wanted a world that could not betray him, so he built a bed, a crown, an empire out of death. And in doing so, he forgot a simpler truth. Fear is a builder that never stops building. The bones have grown silent now. What remains is a choice each of us faces when the world grows dark. Whether to build our lives on fear, layer by layer, or to learn at last to sleep without it.